Great, thank you everybody. We're just waiting a few seconds to let everybody in. Okay, so I think we can slowly kick off. Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Cambridge Future of the Island of Ireland series. My name is Niamh Gallagher. You've probably seen me many times before. I am a historian of Britain, modern Britain and Ireland, and today I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Powell. We've tried to get Jonathan for some time, so we're really excited that we have him here this evening to speak to. Jonathan is CEO of Intermediate, a charity he founded in 2011 to work on global conflict resolution. Intermediate is presently working on the resolution of 10 conflicts around the globe. And from our little chat beforehand, Jonathan spends a lot of time on an aeroplane. More pertinently to this seminar, he was Chief of Staff to Tony Blair from 1995 to 2007, and from 1997 to 2007 was Chief British Negotiator on the peace talks in Northern Ireland. He is the author of 3 books, and most recently that book is Talking to Terrorists, How to End Armed Conflict, published in 2014. Also The New Machiavelli, How to Wield Power in the Modern World, published in 2010. And his first book, Great Hatred, Little Room, Making Peace in Northern Ireland, published in 2008, which obviously is this one here, forms part of the title of his talk today. So our usual format will be happening. Jonathan will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a brief conversation with myself, and then we'll open up questions to the audience. Please submit them at any time via the Q&A function. I would advise you to send these in sooner rather than later, so that they don't bunch up towards the end and we run out of time. So Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you for your talk entitled Great Hatred, Little Room, the Good Friday Agreement and Post-Brexit Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Niamh. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think the Good Friday Agreement worked, and then talk about its history since then, and a bit about the threats to it now. And I'll certainly be within 15 minutes in doing that. When I left government in 2007, they allowed me to go through all the files, the number 10 files for the decade we'd been in number 10 on Northern Ireland, and look through them. And there are a number of things that jumped out of those files at me. And the first was the importance of process. That if you have a process in place, it gives people hope. They think there can be a solution, there can be a way out. And if there is no process, then there's a vacuum, and that vacuum is all too often filled by violence. So our objective was to get the process going, keep it going, and then to bring it to a conclusion, which is always the hardest bit, to actually make people settle at the end of it. Now, there have been 3 previous attempts at trying to make peace in Northern Ireland. There was the Sunningdale Agreement 1973, there was the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 85, and the Downing Street Declaration of 1991. So that was, all 3 failed for different reasons. Content was much the same of Sunningdale Agreement and the agreement that came out in the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, Seamus Mallon called the Good Friday Agreement Sunningdale for slow learners, because it was so much the same, and yet we've been through more than 30 years of violence between the failure of Sunningdale and the success of the Good Friday Agreement. So if you ask yourself, or as I ask myself, why the Good Friday Agreement succeeded when those previous agreements had all failed, I think the most important factor, there are 4 factors I see, and the most important was, I think, being inclusive. That the problem with Sunningdale was that Sinn Féin was excluded, and so were the Loyalists. And in fact, it was the Loyalists who brought down Sunningdale almost immediately with the workers' strike. But the exclusion of Sinn Féin too meant that it was unlikely to succeed. There's an interesting question historically about whether Sinn Féin could have been persuaded to engage if the governments had been prepared to include a political party like Sinn Féin. Some say that it might have been, but even then, I'm not sure that would have spared us the 30 years of violence. In a way, in a horrible way, I think it was necessary to go through at least some of that violence in order to reach the conclusion that there could be an agreement. There are some lessons in that point about being inclusive. For example, the current situation in Gaza, I at least would argue that you're not going to succeed in ending this conflict unless you're inclusive. In other words, unless you include all of the parties, including Hamas, although that would, of course, be unacceptable to most Israelis and unacceptable to many others. But my argument is, if you want the people with guns to stop fighting, it's probably going to be necessary to include them in the negotiations. So the first factor is that the reason it succeeded was it was inclusive, unlike Sunningdale. The second is my point about violence. Academics write about something called perceived mutually hurting stalemate. That's not just a stalemate. When I went for David Cameron to be his envoy in Libya after the war, but almost immediately after the war, I thought, oh, good, there's a stalemate. The East and West had both gained territory, but couldn't gain much more. But I was wrong. It wasn't a mutually hurting stalemate. It wasn't one where the two sides were hurting. They both could gain a bit of territory, a bit of money. And unfortunately, that conflict still goes on as a result. But in Northern Ireland, I think one can argue the British Army realised by at least the end of the 70s, possibly earlier, that they could contain the IRA forever. The IRA would not be a threat to the existence of the state, but they could not defeat it militarily. There'd need to be a political solution. And I think Adams and McGuinness, who both joined the Republican movement quite young, realised probably by the early to mid 1980s, when they were past fighting age. They joined very young, but then they were in their 30s, even 40s, and they could see their nephews, nieces, children getting arrested, getting killed, and they could see that they couldn't win, but they weren't going to be defeated. And that's when Adams started to reach out first to John Hume, who very bravely agreed to meet him despite the political disparagement he got, and then to the Irish government and finally to the British government. So in the case of Northern Ireland, we genuinely did have a perceived mutually hurting stalemate, and that was one of the factors that made the Good Friday Agreement possible when it wasn't possible at those earlier junctures. The third factor, I think, is leadership. Having a strong political leadership, people prepared to take a risk. In Northern Ireland, Tony Blair says correctly, I believe, that we are very lucky to have strong political leadership. And Adams and McGuinness were risking their lives to make peace because they could have been attacked by their own side for selling out. And Ian Paisley and David Trimble, although not very usual sort of British politicians, were in their own way extremely brave and very determined to bring about a peace agreement and offered real leadership to their people to do so. And also we were lucky to have, I think, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, both the fact they were a new generation of leaders, the fact they could work together so closely, more closely than any previous Irish and British leaders, and that they were in power for 10 years. Adams and McGuinness had seen by the time Tony Blair became Prime Minister, I think it was 9 Prime Ministers come and go. So having that continuity for 10 years, having the British and Irish governments working together, gave the sort of strong leadership that makes a political agreement like this possible. In his autobiography, Tony Blair says that I said that he succeeded in making peace in Northern Ireland because he had a messiah complex. It wasn't quite that. Mo Mowlam, who some of you may remember, and maybe some of you are too young, who was a very, very colourful Northern Ireland secretary and who was instrumental in bringing about peace, told me that Tony thought he was effing Jesus, which is not quite the same as a messiah complex, but is related. You need to be able to believe that a peace can be reached. Mrs. Thatcher didn't believe there could be peace in Northern Ireland. John Major did believe there could be peace, but didn't believe he could do it. Tony believed both it could happen and that he could do it. And that was crucial in bringing it about at that juncture. Lastly, I think outside help was important. In so many conflicts nowadays, you've got Sudan or Libya, there are all sorts of external states interfering, trying to keep the process going, backing one side or the other. By the stage we got to in Northern Ireland, there was no longer NORAID, there was no longer money pouring in from the United States, there were no longer weapons pouring in from Libya. And actually all of the help from outside was positive. The US, in the form of Bill Clinton, tried very hard. George Mitchell, who was the US former senator, who was the chair of the talks, contributing the EU too, both in money and in political support. So having that outside support, rather than people trying to stir things up, I think was fundamental. So I think the reason the Good Friday Agreement succeeded when the previous 3 efforts had failed were those 4 reasons in essence. There was, however, something even more important than that to what's happened over the last 26 years since the Good Friday Agreement, because most agreements, think of the Oslo Accords in Israel-Palestine, for example. Everyone celebrated when the Oslo Accords were announced, but they failed. And they failed because neither side actually implemented them or even tried to sell them to their own constituencies. And that's normally when agreements fail. They fall over when they have failed to be implemented. And if we'd thought when we took off in our helicopters from Stormont in Good Friday, the morning of Good Friday of 1998, that we had solved the problem of Northern Ireland, we would be sadly mistaken, because it was another 9 years before we could get the institutions up in a sustainable way. 9 years of very bitter negotiations and very painful negotiations. Tony Blair had to devote a huge amount of his time and political capital to doing it. we'd set a deadline for the Good Friday Agreement. Tony Blair had said he wanted it done within 1 year. We turned up in Belfast, and George Mitchell said to Tony he didn't know why we'd come. There was no chance of reaching an agreement. But by keeping everyone up all day and all night and sustaining it for 3 days and sustaining the idea of this deadline, we managed to get to an agreement. Thereafter, in those following 9 years, we kept setting deadlines one after another, and we just went through all of them because they were not attached to anything in the real world. They were just arbitrary deadlines. And so I think Sinn Féin, and actually the Unionists too, took pleasure in walking through these deadlines that the Prime Minister had set. In the end, in 2006, when it became clear that Tony Blair was going to be leaving government, we tried to set another deadline. We legislated to abolish all the institutions in Northern Ireland if there was no agreement. We invited the parties to St Andrews, to a golf course in St Andrews, and had the negotiations there. And that deadline this time focused their minds because they knew the next Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, would not be devoting the same amount of time to Northern Ireland. They knew the institutions would go. And that did help get to the St Andrews Agreement, which brought the DUP and Ian Paisley on board for the process and got us into eventually a working agreement. In retrospect, I think those 9 years at the time, as I say, they were a pain in the neck, and you thought, why on earth are we doing this? But looking back through the files on them, I think it was necessary. You know, an agreement is just a piece of paper. It doesn't make people trust each other anymore. They have a piece of paper because they don't trust each other. But it's only when they start doing what they said they were going to do. And in Northern Ireland, we had this problem that the Unionists were not prepared to share power with a political party which had a private army at their disposal. And Republicans were not prepared to give up their weapons unless the Unionists were prepared to share power in a way they hadn't been prepared to for the previous 90 years. So we had that standoff, if you like, of trust on both sides. And those 9 years of talks were essentially to try and build enough trust to make the implementation on both sides possible. We kept working at what I would call sequencing or choreography. We try and take the steps promised in the Good Friday Agreement and get each side to put them into practice in small steps, to have John de Chastelain, the Canadian general who was responsible for monitoring the implementation of giving up weapons, to take bold steps. We invited in Cyril Ramaphosa, the now South African Prime Minister, President, and Matias Asari, the former Finnish president, to inspect the weapons dumps. We tried all sorts of ideas, little steps, and eventually got to a choreography that worked and resolved that issue of decommissioning. I asked myself, has the Good Friday Agreement succeeded? And you have to say, it's not a fairy story. No peace agreement is. You don't live happily ever after just because you've got an agreement in place. It doesn't solve all the problems. The problem of sectarianism remains in Northern Ireland. And indeed, for a while, at least, it got worse in terms of peace walls in Belfast, where we actually had more, until recently, more peace walls between the two communities to stop them fighting, stop them throwing things over, than we'd had at the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm glad to say that's going down now. But sectarianism is a generational problem. It doesn't disappear with a peace agreement. We have sectarianism in Liverpool and Glasgow. It takes a very long time to go, and it doesn't get magicked away by an agreement. Secondly, we still have violence. I mean, violence didn't disappear, but it is contained violence. It is very specific and not the generalized, essentially, civil war that we had for the 30 years of the Troubles. And we have, as we've seen very recently, political instability. That too is not cured by an agreement like the Good Friday Agreement. That is something you have to work at, something you have to keep going in the hope of succeeding. But I think I would argue that the Good Friday Agreement has been a success, because what has happened is we are out of the Troubles and we will never go back to the Troubles. We'll have all sorts of problems in Northern Ireland, but going back to the Troubles won't be one of those. I think it's important in that context to bear in mind what the Good Friday Agreement is and what it isn't. The Good Friday Agreement, in essence, is an agreement to disagree. We did not resolve the central issue. Unionists still wanted and still want to remain in a united kingdom. Republicans and nationalists want and still want to be in united Ireland. We didn't square that question. We couldn't have squared that question in the negotiations. What we did was establish the principle of consent, that both parties had to argue for their case. They had to pursue it politically and by peaceful means and not by violence. And that is what allowed us to escape from the dominating issue of identity, which all politics had just been about identity in Northern Ireland for that period. We managed to get them make politics boring, if you like, in Northern Ireland, get people to go back and start thinking about health and education and what you're going to spend your money on, rather than just everything being about identity. And that succeeded till we were disrupted by Brexit. In the referendum in 2016, Tony Blair and John Major went to Northern Ireland to campaign, pointing out the difficulties that Brexit was going to cause by demanding a border. Because if Northern Ireland, along with the rest of the United Kingdom, left the EU, but was on an island, in which Ireland was still a member, there would have to be a border somewhere. A border in the Irish Sea or a border on the island of Ireland. Border on the island of Ireland would be disastrous for the Good Friday Agreement. The border in the Irish Sea would be very, very difficult for the Unionists who wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. So it was warned that this would become the issue. The Brexiteers at the time cheerfully said it could be solved by technology, not bearing in mind that there are reasons that people have borders all around the world and haven't just replaced them with technology. They also argued at the time, and I'm glad to say most of them seem to have forgotten it now, that the Good Friday Agreement had passed its sell-by date and maybe we should just move on. Theresa May, to her credit, when she became Prime Minister and started trying to implement the Brexit Agreement, tried to protect the Northern Ireland status without a border by keeping the whole of the United Kingdom in the customs union. That didn't wash with her party, with the Conservative Party, and to be honest, it'd been very hard to see how it could have worked in practice. But at least she tried to find some way of not upending the Good Friday Agreement through Brexit. Boris Johnson was not quite so solicitous of the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, I would suggest that he engaged in the most excruciating form of vandalism. He actually just stuck a border in the Irish Sea in order to get himself an agreement, and then he lied about it and said there was no border, leaving the Unionists, who are very literal people, in a fury, which has been with us mainly ever since. And I think the reason that Boris Johnson probably did that was he saw this as a sort of trivial issue, the tail wagging the dog. Why on earth would something minor like this hold up a Brexit agreement? Missing the point that if you undermine the Good Friday Agreement and if you would do something so dramatic that tips us back into the Troubles, you'd undermine the work of a political generation on both sides of the Irish Sea. I'm glad to say the new Conservative government has succeeded with the Windsor framework, and particularly through the work of Julian Smith, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, who really was instrumental in getting the DUP back into the institutions of government finally. He worked patiently and consistently to bring that about. And what's happened now with both parties back in power, with Jeffrey Donaldson in court, it's very fragile, but I'm encouraged. I think the Sinn Féin First Minister and the Deputy First Minister from the DUP have demonstrated the willingness to work together in a way we haven't really seen since Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness right at the beginning of the process in 2007 when the institutions were first up and running. So I'm optimistic that it will work, and it has demonstrated that the having Sinn Féin as a First Minister is not actually the threat the DUP are afraid of. People argued it's nothing to do with the border, it's all to do with being afraid of allowing Sinn Féin to be the First Minister of Northern Ireland. They've demonstrated that is not their problem. There are, of course, still threats to the Good Friday Agreement and to peace in Northern Ireland. The first, I think, is history. Northern Ireland has always been bogged down with the two conflicting histories that sometimes it's easier to get an agreement on the future than it is on the past. And here on the history, it's really very difficult to get to an agreement. The government has pushed through this legacy and a reconciliation bill. The problem is not so much their wish to find a way to move on, to put behind us, if you like, all the troubles. It is more their complete failure to consult people properly and bring people along with them. So it's opposed by all of the political parties in Northern Ireland, it's opposed by all of the victims groups in Northern Ireland, it's opposed by the Irish government, and yet they shoved it through. I think that's going to be a really big problem. I think it'll have to be revisited, but I don't dispute the need to find a way to actually get beyond court cases as the way to resolve these things, or even individual inquiries for every single one of these cases, because evidence 20, 30, 40 years later, it just isn't there unless you're lucky to get some DNA evidence. So there needs to be some way. And we have this in nearly every conflict we deal with, from South Africa to Colombia, where we had an elaborate system of transitional justice, which I can talk about if people are interested. So that threat of history, the threat of these court cases, is one threat, I think, to the Good Friday Agreement. The second is the people left behind by the Good Friday Agreement, and particularly the loyalists. You know, the loyalists were instrumental in getting to an agreement. David Irvine, leader of one of the small loyalist parties, was crucial in helping David Trimble stay at the table when Ian Paisley and the DUP walked out. He was able to show he had a unionist majority. He was actually instrumental in the negotiations. He was very challenging to Jerry Adams at a stage where David Trimble wouldn't even talk to Jerry Adams at the negotiations. They now feel excluded. They're not represented politically. They are extraordinarily deprived economically, as some of the tougher Republican areas. The lowest areas of educational attainment, I believe, are still in those loyalist enclaves in Belfast and around Belfast, which is quite extraordinary when you think of the whole of Europe, and that's where the greatest deprivation is. And the third issue, of course, is United Ireland, and maybe we could talk about that in the discussion a bit more. My own view is that it's not going to happen suddenly, and there are some issues that need to be discussed before we ever get to a referendum. And just not talking about it is probably not the right way to approach this. What's going to happen to Stormont? Does it continue in United Ireland? How are the rights of unionists protected? Who's going to pay? What's going to happen to the NHS? There are all sorts of serious questions, and it's difficult to have a referendum until you've at least discussed those issues. And I think it's also important that the British government continues to pay attention to Northern Ireland, because normally the trouble in the past has come because we've stopped paying attention. I'm going to conclude, but just say one thing, and again, maybe we should leave this for the discussion, is can the Good Friday Agreement be altered? I just want to say that, of course, the Good Friday Agreement is not immutable. It contains in it a clause allowing a review of the Good Friday Agreement. And it's also true that if you just leave power sharing in place indefinitely, you will have problems. I mean, Bosnia is a very good example of that. The Dayton Agreement put in place power sharing provisions, which are still there. They've led to terrible corruption. They've led to the inability to throw the rascals out. So you end up with very, very dubious political leaders. And it's remained leaving identity as the issue. So from the lesson we can learn from Bosnia is you don't want to leave that in place all the time. But I think to try and change it in the middle of a crisis, as we've been, would be a mistake. It would also be a mistake to change it just as the provisions which were there to protect a Protestant majority. Now there's no longer a Protestant majority. It's a bit odd to take it away just when it's going to be useful to them, having been useful previously to the Catholic minority. But you can't ignore the fact that things have changed, that the Alliance Party is essentially disenfranchised by this, and the forced coalition is unhelpful. So there is an issue to discuss there. David Trimble told me, I remember after we signed the Good Friday Agreement, he expected politics in Northern Ireland to develop like British politics. You'd have a left party like the Labour Party, a right party like the Conservatives. It hasn't developed that way, interestingly. But what has happened is the centre has started to grow. It's not just the growth of the Alliance Party, which is striking, but also if you looked at the census last time, the number of people now who don't describe themselves as unionists or nationalist Catholics or Protestants, that centre bit is beginning to grow. And that's probably where the change will come from in politics in Northern Ireland as we go forward. So in conclusion, sadly, there is more and more conflict around the world, the area in which I work, more and more deaths from those conflicts. It's not just more conflicts itself, it is the death and suffering has increased. And the Good Friday Agreement is still one of the very few successes out there of agreements. There are remarkably few and sadly few. And people still look to it for inspiration as a way of ending their own conflicts. I think it's fair to say the Good Friday Agreement has lasted despite its challenges. And it's mainly lasted because the people of Northern Ireland themselves want it to work. It really does have the support of the people who it applies to, and also the international support of the US, of the Republic of Ireland, of the UK as a whole, and in Europe. And that support is pretty uniform. There's not many people against that, with the possible exclusion of Michael Gove, who wrote a pamphlet against it many years ago. I'm sure he hopes people don't remember. But if it is to go on, if the Good Friday Agreement is to continue to succeed, I think it does require political leadership in Northern Ireland, political leaders who are prepared to take risks, who are prepared to think about the other side, how the other side perceives political steps, not just their own side. It requires the British and Irish government to continue to remain engaged and to work together, and that's been a problem on immigration recently. But as you know, the relations that became excellent have been harmed by what happened in Brexit, and it will take time to rebuild them. But in conclusion, I am actually pretty optimistic about Northern Ireland. I think there are huge opportunities, a territory that's both in the EU single market and in the UK market, with a relatively educated workforce, relatively low housing costs. Industries in the United States and elsewhere are really looking at this as a place to invest. So if this political institutions can be kept up and running, if we can avoid going back into that psychodrama yet again, then I think Northern Ireland will succeed and will be a dramatic example of how peace processes can in the end work. Thanks, Niamh. Let me stop there. Sorry, it's a bit long, but some food for thought.
Not at all. That was excellent. Thanks very much, Jonathan. So I would love to ask some questions broadly about the past, the present, and the future, which I think you've outlined really well in your talk. First of all, some history. Um, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know what you felt was different about New Labour's approach to Northern Ireland. I mean, you've mentioned Blair, you've mentioned his sort of perceived messianic ambition to solve this crisis, and had been ongoing for a while. But what was different about New Labour's approach in comparison to either previous Labour administrations or indeed the most immediate previous Conservative administration under John Major?
Well, Tony Blair, when he became leader of the Labour Party, changed the Labour Party's policy on Ireland. It had been to be at that stage, it had been under Kinnock, it had been to be a persuader for Irish unity. And he came in and changed that and said the Labour Party was going to support John Major's effort to make peace, even when we thought he was wrong. And actually, we thought sometimes after Canary Wharf he did do the wrong thing, but we supported him anyway because we thought that was a responsible thing to do. So he put in place this sort of bipartisanship that survived largely after the election, not entirely. The Tories played some games, but it broadly worked. And that makes a huge difference. If you're trying to make peace, as the Spanish socialist government did with ETA, and I was helping them on that, and they were constantly under attack from the right, deliberately making politics out of it. Or in Colombia with President Santos, where his predecessor, President Uribe, constantly was attacking it, makes it much, much harder to make progress. So that bipartisanship that Tony Blair established was crucial. And I think just being a new type of government, a new generation. Mo Mowlam was about as different from Paddy Mayhew and Peter Brook, the two previous Northern Ireland secretaries who were both ex-Guards officers who dressed in their Guards ties, looked like British colonial officials. And that just the image of a woman with a wig that she would take off because of cancer, irreverent, charming, going around talking to people. So that second factor was this was a breath of fresh air, and I think Republicans and nationalists were prepared to give it a chance, although unionists were nervous, and that balancing act was very difficult. And lastly, I think because Tony Blair was prepared to put so much political capital into the Northern Ireland peace process, processes like this only work if leaders are prepared to invest their political capital. And he was. His first visit outside of London after being elected in May '97 was to go to Balmoral to an agricultural show outside Belfast and to make a speech reassuring the unionists that we weren't about to sort of ditch them suddenly. So I think it was that changed attitude, the political capital, and helping to keep the unionists on board at the same time with the reassurance. So I think those were different. And of course, John Major, who deserves huge credit for starting the peace process, but he didn't have the political capital. He was at the tail end of his administration. He had a minority by that stage. He didn't have a majority to keep him in place. And they made mistakes. They should not have taken so long to bring Sinn Féin to the negotiating table after the ceasefire. And they just convinced them that they were just being messed around. So there were mistakes, but I think that change is what really made it possible under us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. And again, about history, I mean, on numerous occasions throughout your book, that dreaded word history pops up time and again. I just want to give a handful of examples, which are quite funny, some of them anyway. You were handed a so-called history of the conflict the day you entered number 10. I'd love to know who wrote that. I'm sure you don't even know yourself, some civil servant.
Could be civil servants somewhere. Yeah.
Tasked with the job. And I know they say the conflict started in 1921, not in, say, 1968, which is kind of an agreed upon date by historians. But then many, I imagine, listening today might say, well, it started in 1690 or 1641 or whatever it may be.
19, yeah.
Indeed, yeah. So you were handed a history of the conflict, as you say in your book. In fact, you dedicate an entire chapter to the burden of history. Your initial conversations were effectively history lessons, where many of the leaders of the Republican and Unionist sides would give you a whole catalogue of historical grievances. And I think you also make quite clear that you believe history was very important in the negotiations. So maybe you might just say a little bit about how you felt history helped and hindered the government and your own experience in pursuing resolution. And I'm going to ask you a further question in a second.
Yeah, as you know, I say in the book that if we ended any question after any conversation after 30 minutes for a political party, but it got to 1689 and there were 300 years more of grievance to get to before we got to the current day and what we're going to do about the future. Northern Ireland felt like a place bogged down with history. And to be honest, Tony Blair and I were pretty ignorant of the history. It's lucky they gave us a primer. If we'd actually understood how complicated it was, we probably wouldn't have tried to mess with it. I think what we tried to do was get people to think about the future rather than the past. And this is really a problem nearly everywhere that we've worked. So in Colombia, for example, the FARC, the Marxist guerrillas, and the government had very different interpretations of the last 70 years. And actually what we got them to do there is we put together a historical commission with historians who lean to the FARC point of view, historians who lean to the government point of view, and then some neutral ones. And they pulled together a history for both sides, and then something that tried to square the difference. And if you tried to do the same on Palestine and Israel, you'd find even greater problems. So this problem in history is not unique to Northern Ireland, but it was particularly mired in it, and trying to get them to get out of that and think about the future rather than just about the past was crucial. Maybe it actually helped that we didn't know the history, we didn't know the reasons why things in the past haven't worked. Because as I said, with Sunningdale for slow learners, you usually end up with the same sort of agreement. So it's better not to know that it never worked in the past than just try and make it work this time. As an argument for ignorance, I wouldn't take it too far, but there is certainly a case for ignorance in those circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that did make me think about a particular phrase in your book, one of the dilemmas of publishing something, and someone comes back at you with the sentence you wrote 20 odd years ago. But you mentioned in it that the real or objective history didn't matter so much. What was important was their view of it. Now, I suppose it'd be very fair to say that the British government weren't a neutral actor in the Troubles. They were a participant, as much as any of the other histories that you were listening to and engaging with. So I wonder, what was the objective view of history that helped to guide Blair and your government in making those dialogues and conversations with the various sides?
By training, I know the historians strive for objectivity, but in a heated situation like Northern Ireland, it's pretty difficult for anyone to be truly neutral. I do think that what helped in this case was you had two politicians from a new generation. Tony Blair himself was connected. His grandmother was an Orange woman from the Orange Order in Donegal. He used to spend his summer holidays there as a child. Bertie Hearn's grandfather was an IRA fighter. So they both had the history, but they had managed to escape it in a way that even John Major and Albert Reynolds hadn't actually. I mean, it was even worse with Thatcher and Charlie Haughey. But with Blair, and they said to each other, look, let's move on. Let's just try and put the history behind us. So I think that is more a question of how do you move beyond the history rather than pretending that you've got some pure history that's much better than the other two histories. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd say is that what was interesting was that we were party to the conflict. And of course, the famous speech by Peter Brook, repeated by Paddy Mayhew later, saying we have no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland, was crucial, because we wanted to say, that's why when people now in the Tory party say we're unionists, we're going to campaign for the union, well, how does that fit with what Peter Brook said at the time? Well, what we really wanted was something both sides should agree to. So to start with George Mitchell in the chair, we were a party to negotiations like other parties. Once George left, there needed to be a mediator, and effectively we and the Irish government became the mediator for the next 9 years and spent our time shuttling backwards and forwards between the two sides or meeting them jointly. So in a way, although of course we had our own biases and our own history, we did manage to escape that to the extent that both parties saw us as more or less fair, working with the other government as a mediator between the two sides.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump more to a present related issue, which of course is exercising all matters of opinion, and that's the Legacy Act. You mentioned it in your talk. So I suppose most people attending will know what that is, but for those who don't, in short, it offers a conditional amnesty to accused killers in exchange for cooperating with an independent commission in their investigations. And that the key here is that it has abolished all ongoing investigations of Troubles-related incidents through police investigations, the police ombudsman, new civil claims and inquests. So it's the end of all of that judicial process for this independent commission instead. It's widely opposed by all sections of opinion in Northern Ireland. And I know it's had legal challenges lately. So I'd just like your views a little bit more on this Legacy Act, and if you think actually it is a good thing that the government is pursuing this, especially when most people in Northern Ireland seem to be against it, and what you would advise them if you could advise them today.
Well, I have some sympathy because it's a very difficult issue. Traditionally, in the olden days, if you came to a peace agreement of this sort, you'd simply have an amnesty, it'd be pikes in the thatch. And in effect, the Good Friday Agreement is an amnesty because we said everyone's out of jail after just 2 years, whatever they've done, murder or whatever, they just get out. So it was effectively an amnesty. I mean, they were released on conditional bail, but it was an amnesty. In modern peace processes, you can't really do that. You have to find a way of dealing with the victims rather than just ignoring the victims. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation process, which is often held up as a paragon, if you dig into it more deeply, I remember talking to F.W. de Klerk about it, and he said that it was victor's justice. It wasn't what they'd expected at all. It didn't really help to bring about reconciliation. And if you talk to members of the ANC, they say, well, we didn't get proper justice because Chris Biko, we didn't get the people who, Steve Biko, we didn't get the killers of Steve Biko. It wasn't done properly. So even that, which is the sort of paragon we all hold up, wasn't perfect. In Colombia, because Colombia is subject to the ICC, something that would have affected us if the Good Friday Agreement was done now, you couldn't have an amnesty because the ICC would then prosecute both the soldiers and the guerrillas after the peace agreement. So they've set up a system of transitional justice that is quite unpopular, particularly in the right wing, because soldiers are subject to it. But I have to say, it's had some successes. The HEP, this particular court, international court they've set up, had a cathartic effect. You produce soldiers go to the area where they killed lots of innocent civilians and sort of confess and try and make amends. And it does, talking to some of the victims and their families, it has a real effect, and the other way around as well. So I think there's something to be said for that system of transitional justice. So in the case of Northern Ireland, when we left government, we still hadn't resolved this issue. So we set up a commission with Robin Eames, the Protestant Archbishop, and Dennis Bradley, a former Catholic priest, to look at it. And they reported back after we'd left. And they said neither side, neither Republicans nor Unionists want a truth and reconciliation process. They just want to just leave things as they are. And so that's why we've been struggling with this ever since. The problem's not gone away. We had the agreement, the Stormont House agreement, etc. We keep trying to find a way of dealing with it. So I do have some sympathy with the government, because as time passes, it's harder and harder to produce evidence to get a fair trial for anyone, whether it's a 90-year-old soldier or an 85-year-old terrorist. It's really difficult. And so it ends up being sort of a matter of luck, and people don't get the satisfaction of knowing what happened. Mm-hmm. Equally, you can't leave the victims just with nothing. I think the government went completely the wrong way about it. They sort of went through, firstly, they started by making it something to pardon soldiers. Then as an afterthought, they added in the others. And they made not really sufficient efforts to bring the victims and the political parties on board. So it's now discredited with everyone in Northern Ireland and has been denounced, well, not denounced, has been one key aspect of it's been overruled by the courts in Northern Ireland. So I think whoever's going to deal with this is going to have to not go all the way back to the square one, because that would just take too long, but to reconsider all this, to consult properly with the victims and families and say there has to be a way of doing this, and we're willing to talk to you about how it should be done properly, and then come up with a solution. There is a difficult balance, I'd say, between peace and justice. If you were in Colombia and you go to the FARC leaders, of whom there were 7 in the Secretariat, and you say to them, we'd like to make peace with you, but by the way, each of you is going to jail for 32 years for massacres. For some reason, they're not so interested in the peace negotiation. On the other hand, you can't leave the victims completely out of it. And we invited the victims to the negotiating table to consider what the process should be. It's a difficult balance between the victims of the past, who you have responsibilities to, and the victims of the future, who you want to avoid. And getting that balance right is incredibly difficult.
Brilliant. Well, maybe that brings me on to thinking about an even more recent aspect of that Legacy Act, which is the creation of an independent advisory panel to explore a so-called public history of the Troubles. And again, just to tell our listeners, amongst academics and within scholarly communities, this has created a lot of press in recent weeks. Few scholars would call it anything other than an official history. The use of public history is itself redundant and seen as a political tool by the government. And regardless of the defence that's been put up by the committee, it's widely seen as part of the implementation of the government's wider legacy process. So I just wonder, what your view is on this committee, Jonathan, and do you think it's a good idea to run a so-called public history of the Troubles when there is so much doubt, and indeed it's already been judged before the archives have even been opened? Is it a worthwhile exercise, do you think?
Basically, no, but I do understand why they're groping for something. As I said, in Colombia, we had this process to try and get to a common understanding of history. It is pretty unclear that that was very helpful. They did it, and they managed to publish the two-sided history and the sort of common history of a sort. But I don't think it really resolved anything, and that was a lot less history than Ireland was bogged down with. It was only 70 years. So I don't know it's going to solve anything. I mean, the commission was supposed to look into the specific crimes. I'm more sympathetic to. I think those are good people they put on that commission. I think it'd be given an impossible task, but I think they're perfectly good people. And I think if one could try and come up with a differentiated approach that was acceptable to victims and political parties, you'd probably keep that commission in place. I don't know what you do about the history one, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. Okay, then I suppose I'll jump onto the future before we get to some questions from the audience. Obviously, Northern Ireland wasn't solved in 1998. It's been a very rocky road to devolution, and we've had a larger period probably out of government than we've had within it. What went wrong, in your opinion, after 1998? Why? Why has it been so difficult?
Well, I think the reason I gave, which is that people have been killing each other, don't suddenly trust each other because someone signed a piece of paper. They still think that the people on the other side of the fence are going to try and kill them. They still think they're not being treated as equals. You don't resolve all those problems overnight. It takes time to implement it. Why they haven't managed to stay in government is because those feelings are so strong. The people, and both sides have pulled the government down. It wasn't as if it was just the Unionists who pulled it down. The Republicans pulled it down too previously. Although I suspect that Martin McGuinness was pretty reluctant to do so. But anyway, they did. And once you pulled it down, it's very hard to put back up again without losing face, because you need a ladder to climb up. And that's why the Tory government had to spend so much time coming up with a ladder that the DUP could climb up to get back into government, and all credit to them in doing so. So I think that nothing's inevitable, but in a process like this, you're going to have these ups and downs, and politics is a better way to have the ups and downs than some conflicts where you go back to fighting. After Oslo, we went into the second intifada, and that was actually worse than the first intifada. So all too often you tip back into full-scale civil war in those circumstances, and that hasn't happened in Northern Ireland. We've had political crises, and that has led to real-world consequences, for example, in the health service in Northern Ireland, the latest lacuna in government. But I think as long as the British and Irish governments remain engaged, as long as they keep pushing to get the government back up and running again, as long as the people of Northern Ireland don't lose hope in the process, then it will keep going. So I think I would say it's not a surprise. It's unfortunate that has happened, but it isn't necessarily a surprise. At one stage, I was slightly worried in that it seemed that it was almost possible for Paisley and Martin McGuinness, the Chuckle brothers, to do things. These people have both played a role in starting the conflict of different sorts. And yet the first time they actually physically met in Stormont, they immediately started cracking jokes and getting on with each other. And they were able to stay in government for, the whole time that Ian Paisley remained alive. I was worried the next generation was not able to make it work in the same way. But I'm hoping, looking at the new First Minister and Deputy First Minister, actually there is now a commitment for a generation who were not themselves involved in the conflict to make it work.
If I might just press you a little bit on that. I mean, you've made a very good case to say that, there are internal problems, and I think a lot of people would acknowledge those, and perhaps leadership hasn't been quite as strong, perhaps, and certainly with the communities and with each other than it would have been in the phase of the talks. But you also made a strong case to say that actually this conflict would not have been solved had it not been for external mediation. And that also includes the Republic of Ireland and the UK. So I wonder, the UK itself has been, I would broadly say, disengaged in Northern Ireland, certainly under the last Conservative government. And I would wonder, would that play a role in why Northern Ireland itself has not managed to have successful, stable government? We can think of a handful of examples: the lack of knowledge among different secretaries of state for Northern Ireland, and the sheer number of them that there has been in the recent past. Maybe flippant comments made by influential ministers, the Home Secretary Priti Patel about the Irish famine, for example. I mean, there's just been a lack of knowledge and perhaps the perception that it's not really our problem. I mean, Brexit was the fantastic evidence of that, that the border itself wouldn't have been an issue. And of course, it was the single greatest issue. So to what extent does the British government, do you think, does the spotlight need to be on them for the failure of governance in Northern Ireland? And what could they have done better?
Well, I think, as I said in my concluding remarks, the problem is the British government paying attention. I look back at the history, at least a bit of the history of Northern Ireland. There was always a problem when the British government wasn't paying attention. So if you look at the 60s, when the Home Office was notionally responsible for Northern Ireland, and Hayden Phillips, who was then the private secretary of the Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, would write letters, he would tell me, to anyone who wrote about Northern Ireland saying, it's nothing to do with us, go and ask the Northern Ireland installment government. So we just sort of washed our hands of the whole thing. And of course, that went horribly wrong. And then we had to intervene, and we intervened in such a heavy hand, we ended up tangled in it for another 30 odd years. So I think the lesson for me anyway is if the British government tries to ignore or doesn't pay sufficient attention to Northern Ireland, then it tends to go wrong again. So Tony Blair was remarkable in how much time and effort and capital he was prepared to invest in Northern Ireland. Gordon Brown didn't want to do the same as his predecessor, although to be fair to him on the policing issue, he came in, he really put effort into it, put a lot of money into it too, to bribe the parties to come back into government. And the problem then comes with, if you're on one side, as Boris Johnson positioned himself as a unionist, especially as a non-trusted unionist, then you've got real problems. You need to have a British government working with an Irish government seen as even-handed, but constantly engaged in the issue. So I think I would say that's the problem. And as you say, some of the comment, I think Boris Johnson's comment about the border between Ireland, North and South being the same as the border between Camden and Islington for the congestion charge just sort of sums up his Northern Irish policy.
Okay, great. My last question before I move on to the audience, and just a reminder to the audience, please keep sending them in now so we don't run out of time. You talked about different lessons that can be taken away from your experience in the negotiations. So I was just wondering, I mean, have you actually seen the fruits of this in other contexts? And if you might be able to tell us a little bit about how Northern Ireland has driven or indeed helped conflict resolution elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting the power that Northern Ireland still has as a model for people trying to make peace elsewhere. Actually, next week, the British Foreign Office is holding a big conference in Belfast with all of the various funders of peace processes around the world, you know, from Norway to Switzerland to Germany to Canada and so on. They're all coming there, and all the NGOs who work on peace, because Northern Ireland is a place where, one of the few places, as I said, where there is still a functioning, successful peace agreement. And we take a lot of people from conflict areas to Northern Ireland. I remember taking Aung San Suu Kyi there, of Burma, Myanmar, and she has quite strong opinions on things. Now, sadly locked up by the junta, but as soon as she got there, she buttonholed the unionist, the DUP Speaker of Parliament, and said, literally shaking him, saying, "Unless you have integrated education, you're never going to solve this problem. It's obvious." Very taken aback. Sometimes people are a bit too literal about the lessons to learn. So in the Basque Country, ETA, who had a military relationship with the IRA during the Troubles, they kind of took the Good Friday Agreement almost as if it was a Bible and tried to apply it to the Basque Country. But the conflict was different. There were similarities, but it was different. They were too literal in the way they tried to apply it. But even somewhere as different as the FARC, which wasn't a separatist issue, it was an issue of ideology, the battle, and mainly about agricultural reform. There too, there are interesting lessons, not from the substance. There's no model from Northern Ireland you could take and plonk down somewhere else, but lessons of sort of almost prosaic things like, how do you frame a negotiation when you're starting it? How can you start a negotiation unless you start a secret back channel first so you can talk to a terrorist group that's killing your people, because you can't be seen to be talking to a terrorist group of that sort. So there are all sorts of practical lessons that do seem to apply, frankly, anywhere from Gaza to the Ukraine to Venezuela to North Korea. It's interesting how some of those similarities, and I always say to people, if you're going to make a mistake in your negotiation, you might as well at least make a new one instead of repeating one that someone's made already. And people do seem to get that idea.
Policymakers take note. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Oh, we've got plenty of questions here. I'm going to ask you just a couple now. There's a personal dimension to this. Your brother Charles, who pronounced himself Charles Powell, I think you said, was a key foreign policy advisor to Thatcher, so Margaret Thatcher of an earlier era. And Thatcher is best summed up with her policy on Northern Ireland, but on many other things within Britain. A crime is a crime is a crime. And of course, she's seen as a very important figure for, let's say, exacerbating the conflict in Northern Ireland rather than bringing it to a conclusion, though those back doors you mentioned were indeed opened. So you have a familial or a family dimension to this. Charles, key policy advisor to Thatcher, and then yourself under Blair. You took very different approaches. I just wonder if you might comment on that to brothers in the same family with different support for different parties and very different approaches to this crisis.
Yeah, well, we were both servants to our masters, so it's more them than us, as it were. And Charles, paid a price for that. He was on a death list of the IRA for 8 years as a result of working with Thatcher um, in those years. And the strange thing about Thatcher was that she did take very doctrinaire line on things. She did refuse to allow Adams and McGuinness to speak on television and really silly steps like that. On the other hand, she signed up to the Anglo-Irish Agreement. She later distanced herself from it, but that was in later life. But at the time, she put the effort into negotiating the Good Friday Agreement with Garret Fitzgerald. My brother has a good story about that because all the negotiations used to happen late at night after European summits, so they couldn't be seen meeting specially, so it would remain secret, particularly from the unionists. Mrs. Thatcher would quite regularly go to sleep in these sessions because she was just so tired after the dinner at the European Council. And my brother would encourage Garret Fitzgerald not to wake her up. It'd be much easier to reach agreement if he just set out his points, and then Charles could write them down and take them back and agree them. So that was a very wise approach to it. I think the difference really was between Tony Blair and Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher just didn't believe really there could be peace in Northern Ireland, and she did hate terrorism and did believe that you could go a long way with security measures, although what she was obsessed with was hot pursuit across the border, which she was never able to get, because she believed that if that could happen, you might be able to stamp out the terrorism. And of course, she herself was nearly assassinated by, and many of her friends were assassinated by the IRA. So she had a different approach. Tony Blair was determined to make peace work and believed it could be done, hadn't himself been threatened or injured by the IRA. So I think it was a difference of personal approach rather than me or Charles. We were just servants helping our respective masters to achieve it.
Yeah, this leads us on to the next question about Thatcher, which I imagine you've more or less answered anyway. One questioner is saying that she poured fuel on the fire by not allowing prisoners to wear their own clothes during the hunger strikes, and therefore opened the floodgates to more IRA recruitment and indeed the prolonged conflict that the Troubles actually was. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, there were plenty of British prime ministers who poured flames on the fire. I mean, Bloody Sunday, the various other sort of security terrible mistakes by the British Army, in many ways were worse than what Thatcher did. And remember, Thatcher did negotiate the end of the first hunger strike. That was an interesting one done by the back channel. It was Michael Oakley who went to Belfast International Airport and negotiated with Father Mika for the end of the first hunger strike. And then it all went wrong for the second hunger strike. So, yeah, I'm not going to pretend that she didn't. She was a unionist, and she did want to stamp out terrorism, and she did make things worse. That's undoubtedly true. But I think it'd be hard to blame just her. Harold Wilson, frankly, and Ted Heath and Jim Callaghan and various Northern Ireland secretaries all made terrible, terrible mistakes. And that's when you look at Israel and what Israel's doing now. Maybe they should learn some lessons from the way the British government handled this dispute earlier on.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you. So we have a question here from Stephen Butcher about part of the power sharing mechanism that's devised to protect the minority within Northern Ireland was the petition of concern. And naturally that's come up time and again as a problem part of the Good Friday Agreement. The DUP has adopted it time and again to block measures it doesn't like, though other parties have used it too. None as often as the DUP, I might add. Is it time for a rethink? Asks Stephen. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I always get confused about the exact mechanics of these things. As I said, I think that power sharing in general and the veto of that through the position of is that what it's called? Concern is problematic long term. It was necessary to protect particularly the Catholic minority to start with, because for 90 years, 90, however long it was, they hadn't they'd been kept out of politics. They were not in power at all. So there had to be a method that allowed the two to be in power together. And there needed to be a veto to stop the majority simply rolling over the minority. That now looks antiquated. But as I said, to change it just to the stage where it's coming to the defense of the DUP and the Unionists rather than defense of the Catholic minority, which is no longer a minority, would be a mistake. But it is time to start thinking about how you're going to make the system work in the future. You've got the SDLP now who've become the opposition. So that doesn't really work if you've got the D'Hondt system. So you need, definitely these things need to be revised. You just need to be careful how you do it. I mean, I agree with the alliance, it needs to be changed, but just sort of wipe it out, you just create another political crisis when we just survived this one and got the institutions back up and running again. So I would advise care in tinkering with it, but this is the time to start discussing it and thinking about it.
Great. Another question that was sent in is regarding your own engagement with loyalist leaders. I don't know much about this, Jonathan, so maybe you can say just a few words about that. And do you believe your engagements with loyalist leaders have been a success, especially as there is some doubt as to where the monies are actually going? So maybe you clarify that for us.
Yeah, no, this is an issue that's quite controversial in Northern Ireland. My feeling is this, that the loyalists did get left behind during the Good Friday Agreement. As I say, they're crucial in the negotiations. They then couldn't get any political seats. They've been used by the bigger unionist parties historically, sort of a cannon fodder, rather than actually getting their interests represented. And as I said, the deprivation in those areas is really very serious indeed. Even in government, I actually met with the UDA and UVF High Command. I have to say they were much more terrifying figures in those days than nowadays. Because I thought it was important for government to engage with them and find a way, just the way that Mo Mowlam went to visit them in prison to try and get them back on board for the Good Friday Agreement, and succeeded, I'm glad to say. We would have probably stopped her doing it if we'd done, but she did the right thing. So that was the context in which I engaged with them again, having left government. They set up a group to bring together the three different organizations to see if they could get onto a political track, and money was raised to try and see what could be done. I know there's a controversy about whether money's been abused. I'm not sure there's much evidence of that, other than the problem that worries me more is that some parts of the groups, not the ones who are directly engaged in that, are still engaged in criminality on a fairly crude sort. And it's difficult to see people in Northern Ireland being happy with that. On the other hand, if you don't bring the loyalists inside the tent, when we had the rioting on before the Windsor Agreement, etc., it was the loyalist communities who are out there on the streets. And if we want to bring that to an end, I think we need to find a way to bring them inside the tent rather than leave them outside. And if people criticize me for doing that, that's okay. But then I'd like to know what their answer is for stopping this, because just policing it hasn't worked for the last 20 years. So I'd like to see what the alternative is.
Thank you. Great. And we have another question here from Fergal McCarthy. And I'm very glad you asked this, Fergal. I was going to ask it myself. Jonathan, I'd love to know your views on Blair's apology for the Irish famine and role in moving peace negotiations and process along. And I suppose the same can be true after Bloody Sunday, when David Cameron made an apology as well. So what do you think the importance is or is not of official apologies in international relations?
It is striking that politicians always apologise for things someone else did rather than what they did. But I think it was important. I mean, we found it hard to believe when the Irish government and political parties told us that an apology for the Irish family would make a big difference. For us, it seemed just so symbolic rather than real. But Bertie in particular convinced us it was necessary, and we did it, and it did have an impact. I think the Bloody Sunday one was more important. Bloody Sunday inquiry took a long time and cost a lot of money. And I was rather irritated when at one stage Martin McGuinness said to me, he wished we hadn't done all that, we should just have apologised, which I could have kicked him. But actually what David Cameron did at the end was highly creditable. He threw away his speech. He did make apologies that had a cathartic effect on the people, the families who suffered, and the community as a whole in Derry. So I think that was really important. So I do think, we talked about history and the impact of history. Sometimes you can, and I've seen this in other conflicts too, you can have a cathartic effect that can really help you move on and change things. So I certainly don't regret either of those things now. I think they were the right thing to do, and they did work. It could have been done a bit earlier by the British government in those cases, and in the case of the Amritsar massacre and various other things. So yeah, we've got quite a lot to apologise for. I sometimes think the work I'm doing around the world, from Myanmar to Middle East to Nigeria, is to do with the sins of my ancestors.
Sins of your ancestors. Well, perhaps that's a good place to leave it. Jonathan, it's now 7 o'clock, so we want to say thank you very much for your time. What a really thrilling discussion this was, covering all aspects of past, present, and future Northern Ireland. And to our attendees, thank you very much. This will be online on our website. That's the St. Catherine's College website. Please stay tuned for future events. Indeed, a recording of this will be up in the future, and an accompanying blog, etc. Okay, so we'll leave it there, and thank you all very much for your time, and especially to you, Jonathan.
Well, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.